Hello to Il Mangia Avventura. I'm Michael Land, and I just had a wonderful interview with these folks, and so I hope you enjoy it. Thanks a lot.
Signori e signori, benvenuti nel podcast dei Mangia Avventure, dove approfondiremo le vite degli artisti che hanno plasmato il paesaggio dalla musica allo sviluppo nei videogiochi. Oggi abbiamo l'onore di sederci con una vera leggenda del settore, Michael Land, originario della zona di North Shore, a nord di Boston, Massachusetts. Il percorso musicale di Land ha avuto inizio con le lezioni di pianoforte classico, a soli 5 anni, portandolo infine nei mondi elettronici di LucasArts e Lucasfilm Games. Dopo essersi immerso nella ricca trama della musica elettronica ad Harvard e al Mills College, Land si unì al pionieristico Lucasfilm Games nel 1990, intraprendendo una carriera che avrebbe per sempre trasformato l'esperienza uditiva del gaming. Dal suo rivoluzionario lavoro su The Secret of Monkey Island al complesso sistema iMuse, i contributi innovativi di Land continuano a risuonare nel mondo del gaming. Unisciti a noi mentre esploriamo l'evoluzione sinfonica di Michael Land, dalle sue prime influenze di Yes e Jimi Hendrix al suo profondo apprezzamento per Beethoven e la polifonia rinascimentale, con una discografia che legge come una vera e propria Hall of Fame delle colonne sonore dei videogiochi. La capacità di Land di mescolare stili e strumenti diversi ha lasciato un'impronta indelebile sull'industria. Quindi, senza ulteriori indugi, immergiamoci nel regno musicale di Michael Land e scopriamo i segreti dietro le melodie che hanno affascinato giocatori di tutto il mondo.
Okay. Hello. We are here with Michael Land. It's a real pleasure.
Howdy.
I think he needs no introduction. World famous composer for many video games we love. And
yes,
tonight,
in some circles. Yeah, in certain circles, no introduction needed. Yes.
And tonight we're going to talk a bit about his career in general, but also, if he likes, about some present stuff and what he's working on currently. But let's start from the very beginning. And I'd like to ask you what ignited your passion for music, and when did it start?
Wow, that's a great question. I've always been in love with chord progressions. I feel like there's a lot of emotional power in chord progressions. And I traced that back when I was very young, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old. My mom bought me a little toy organ, right? It's like this big, and it had a little keyboard on it. But it also had these 6 little buttons, which was like C major, G major, D minor, A minor, F major, right? Just the main chords that you would get. And I would spend a long time, hours, just playing the different buttons and hearing how the chords moved. And this was when I was a little kid. And I think somehow that got inside me, because all my life I've just really approached music sort of through the harmonic perspective. Melody kind of comes when it comes, but the harmony is always the root.
Oh yeah, I see.
So, and then when I was, I guess probably I was 14 years old, I was at camp, and I saw a band playing guitar, bass, and drums, just a trio. And I went over and I just stuck my head in front of the bass amp, and I just kept it there. And I was like, I want to learn how to play the bass. And so I learned how to play the bass.
Oh,
and at that point, I had been taking piano lessons, my whole life, but I just could never practice enough. I could never force the discipline. But when I got a bass finally, I just practiced all the time. And so I just fell in love with that instrument. And I kept playing piano. It's a funny thing about playing piano. When I quit playing piano, that's when I actually really started to play piano. So
right. Maybe more for composing? Maybe.
Yeah, I initially for improvising. I would just play little chord patterns and then improvise melodies on top of them. And, it sort of became more fun. And so I just did it more. So then between the bass and the piano, that was kind of my foundation. And then in college, I took a course in electronic music from an absolutely amazing composer who did a lot of innovations in electronic music, and then that started to open up the landscape a little bit to all the different possibilities of sound. So those are the main foundations.
Nice. I'm a bass player too, so I can
Great.
relate. Yeah.
Nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's your main instrument along with piano?
Yeah, I'm probably, I would say I'm a skilled bass player and a barely competent pianist.
Okay, nice.
So it gives more liberty and some sort of that, instead of having the discipline to use the piano constantly.
Yeah.
I have another question. After this period of studying, when did you start creating music for video games, and how was this approach?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually didn't really think much about video games until I got my job. So I was working previously at a company called Lexicon that makes digital effects processors. And I was looking for my next job. And again, my mom, she was like, look in the newspaper. I was like, there aren't any good jobs in the newspaper. But, to humor her, I looked in the newspaper and there was this listing. It just said, sound designer, C, 8086. And I was like, wait a minute, sound and software? That seemed like a very interesting combination. And I had both of those skills. And so I called up the headhunter, and it turned out that that was the job at LucasArts. And so I went in for interviews. It went great, and got the job. And that's when I really started thinking about games. And at that point, game music was still very early. It was 1990. So the PC internal speaker, which is just a single voice square wave, was one of the main ways that it was delivered. But then there was this new thing called the MT32, which had just come out. And so we were starting, that LucasArts was going to support that as well. And of course, the ad lib card was everywhere at that point. And so, it was really an interesting time, because the most, on the MT32, something could sound very rich and beautiful, but then on the PC internal speaker, it just sounded like, beeps and boops, and you had to be able to cover that entire range. So it really forced thinking about stuff. But that was really when I started to realize that games were very, very interesting creatively, because LucasArts games had such great creatives. The art and the storytelling was just so amazing, and so the music really had a lot of opportunity to support all of that creativity.
And I think that also the limitations of the technology at the time really developed the creativity more.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You had to work within boundaries. And initially the boundary was very strict, which was you could start it and loop it and stop it. And that's all you could do. And so that was, the first Monkey Island, that's all we were able to do. But then we spent about a year, myself and Peter McConnell, working on the iMuse system, so that by the time Monkey 2 came along, we could actually do a lot of stuff, a lot of branching and things like that. So we really, pushed hard against those limits.
Nice. We'll get to the iMuse.
But you start with the most difficult one, so the PC speaker, or you start from the MT32 and then you simplify the sound going on?
It was that, yeah. I would always start with the MT32, because the sounds were so inspiring. They were so, you could really sort of enter into the world, into the landscape that way. And then from there we would reduce them down for the ad lib, and that was still sort of multiphonic and some timbre variation, but a lot more restrictive. And then finally, when writing for the PC speaker, that was a very interesting challenge, because at that point you're basically writing, what Bach would do when he would write a violin piece, a solo violin, is he'd have the bass, the chords, and the melody all played with the violin in between each other. So that was the strategy for the PC speaker, is you have to do the bass, the chords, and the melody, and get them out of each other's way. So you could only do one note at a time, but you could do all three parts at a time if you did it right. So that was an interesting challenge. Yeah.
I have the third question that is if you can tell us your experience with Lucasfilm games and LucasArts, and your experience in the Skywalker Ranch.
Great question. Yeah, Skywalker Ranch. So there's two answers to that question. There's two sides to the coin, so to speak. On the one hand, it was extremely inspiring, and just like you felt like you're part of this big creative world, this sort of energy of creativity and all of the power that can bring. Because I mean, Skywalker Ranch is amazing, and you realize that all of this amazing stuff sprang from a creative endeavor. It's like, wow. But the other side of it is that it can make you feel very small when you're not George Lucas, right? Because you're in this giant, I mean, Skywalker Ranch in itself is kind of a giant artwork. And so you're, just this one little person doing this, this game stuff, but, you're inside of somebody else's giant artwork. It just kind of was a little bit of cognitive dissonance. I would say it was a net positive because the environment was so beautiful and there was such support and room for creativity, but it did have that other side to it.
Oh, that's very interesting. We tend to, we tend to hear all the, the fun stuff, but
yeah, there's a ton of fun stuff. I mean, it's just a beautiful place with a lot of, tons of creative people, and everybody's super nice and friendly, and it's an amazing environment for being creative. It's just, there is this sense of awe that can somehow be a little daunting at times.
And you said that David Fox brought you into Lucasfilms,
Yes.
LucasArts. Okay.
Yeah, it was Lucasfilm Games at the time. Yeah.
Okay. And was it Monkey Island your first game at Lucasfilms?
Interestingly enough, that was the first game where I wrote music while on the job. The interesting thing is that one of the pieces that I did, so I needed to. So when I went in for my interview, okay, so prior to my interview, I submitted a demo tape of some of my music, and a lot of it was very abstract and sort of like I say, I had studied electronic music, so it was very sonically interesting, but not necessarily traditional music. And I went in for the interview, and I saw that these games aren't going to work well with super abstract electronic music. There needs to be some traditional music for these games. So I went home after the interview and I composed a piece just to prove that I could write traditional music, which was a German march. Because one of the games, there were some Nazis in one of the games. I was like, okay, well, let's write a Nazi theme. And so I wrote that theme and sent it after the fact saying, hey, by the way, I can write normal music as well. And it turns out that theme worked really well as the theme for Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, which was a game that Larry Holland was just finishing up when I arrived at Lucasfilm Games. So we put the two together, and that became the theme. So that was technically my first game score, but I didn't write it while I was an employee. I wrote it in order to become an employee.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of Monkey Island, I think it's a very, of course, legendary soundtrack and very interesting musically. Where did the inspiration come from for that music? Because I hear a lot of things merging, blending, like Caribbean reggae music.
Yeah, exactly. That was Ron. I think Ron Gilbert was the one who sort of guided the direction, but it was kind of like, okay, you're in the Caribbean and you're dealing with pirates, and the Caribbean makes you think reggae, but pirates make you think pirates, like old English folk songs.
Oh yeah.
And so it was really the combination of those two. It was, old English folk songs done with a reggae groove. And so I forget who coined the term pirate reggae, but that seems to be the term that we always called it. But interestingly enough, there was a time in my life, I much more recently, like just a couple of years ago, I noticed another connection there, which is when I was in college, in high school and college, I worked a little bit with a French folk singer who used to travel the world and give concerts at schools. And his name was Jacques Ivar, and he had a style of writing these old-sounding sort of French shanty type stuff, which I internalized as well. So I think that was also one of my influences for that style.
Nice. Yeah, you can hear traditional folk from various regions in there, and that's also nice that it gets this electro treatment for with video game music. It's a very nice blend. Yeah.
Yeah. Totally.
Yes.
Yeah.
The next question regards, as you said before, the iMuse system. Our friends want to know about the history of iMuse system. It was created with Peter McConnell, or he created the system and you adapted the music on this. And in general, was it a complicated process?
Yeah. So where iMuse came from. So after Monkey Island 1, Secret of Monkey Island, after that shipped, I got this idea that, we need to be able to do more. So I put together a software specification for all the different features that one would want, and then looked at it and I realized I can't do this alone. And so Peter McConnell was an old friend. I'd worked with him at Lexicon and had gone to college with him as well. So I knew him for many, many years. And I basically pulled him in and said, hey, guy, you got to come in here and help me build this system. And so together we built the system, and it was an engine. I mean, in a way, it was kind of similar to today's middleware systems. It was an engine that could do a lot of different things, and then a bunch of control hooks that sat on top of the engine. And yeah, it was super complicated. It was a pain in the neck.
And,
I can imagine.
This makes me think, because I was watching videos of Monkey Island 2, where you can really hear the iMuse, its glory, and it really works seamlessly, between the transitions. And technically, did you make sure that the BPM was the same for all the transitions? Because I felt like they were merging, and the tempo was the same, and the themes would change.
We use the term jump hook is what we called it, but basically it was a little, so back in, it was all MIDI based initially. And so in MIDI, you have this thing called system exclusive messages, which are these messages that you can embed in the MIDI stream that can contain any information you want. And so we defined a set of system exclusive messages that would allow you to essentially impose a grid work over the music that would define all the interconnections, or potentially turning on and off different instrument parts at different moments. And so those were the two main things. We thought of it as, the jump hooks would take you to a different place. We thought of that as horizontal movement. And then the instrumentation turning on in different places, we thought of that as vertical changes, changes in the stack of instruments. And so what we would do is we would have, the standard stuff was to have one or two or three ending chunks where you would have a piece of music that was a loop, and every half a measure typically you would have a jump hook that took you, and sometimes it would have a random ability, like the ability to randomly pick among, say, 3 different destinations, and then it would take you, and so because the hook happens like on a downbeat, or maybe you put it 10 clicks before the downbeat so that it arrives 10 clicks before the downbeat at the destination, so it keeps the tempo consistent. Other times there would be a situation where you want to get from one loop into another loop, and so you would write a transition chunk. And a lot of times if the 2 loops were at a different tempo, then the transition chunk would have a tempo ramp. So you would start at one tempo, go into the transition, and then the transition would gradually change tempo, maybe change key, and then enter into the other loop, and then the other loop would go. Then there was one place, Woodtick, where I went crazy with it, and I wrote a different ending for every measure of 6 or 7 different orchestrations of the theme. And so it was like hundreds and hundreds of transition chunks. ending chunks, hundreds of them, and it was crazy. And I never did that again because it was way too much work. But boy, did it sound good!
Wow, yes, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
This kind of transition hides a real monster in the back.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
Is it like the same that now happens with automation and stuff like that, more or less, with softwares?
Similar. I mean, there's, you can do, stuff like Fmod and Wise give you these kinds of capabilities nowadays. There's lots of different ways that people do this stuff. There really is a sort of common patterns. There are certain common patterns, and so we found a lot of those patterns really early on. But even today, those patterns still continue in a lot of game scores because they're just, they're the right solution for the situation.
Yeah, you established the standard in a way, I think.
Yeah, we sort of found, we kind of mined the territory. We were the first miners out there with our shovels, basically, but others have mined it quite a bit since then.
Nice.
We know that you work also on X-Wing of Star Wars. What it was like expanding on the music of Star Wars themes and also adding the new music to them?
Wow, that's a great question. Obviously, it goes without saying how brilliant John Williams is, and also a really nice guy. I had a chance to talk to him once on the phone, and so we took that responsibility very seriously. We recognized that there was, a real canon of great music there that we needed to become caretakers of and bring into the game domain. And so, what do? You get the score. So we got the score, the orchestral score, and we studied it and recreated parts of it with MIDI and got to the point where we became familiar with what he had actually composed. And in some cases, we, used it literally, but in a lot of cases in a game, you have to create a range of emotions where you can't just have this and this, you got to have everything in between as well. So that was, in a way, it was a lot of, learning what he did and then extrapolating it to fill in all the different dimensions that needed to get filled in order to cover the interactivity of the game.
Wow.
This is a case where the O or Skywalker Ranch comes into play. So.
Yes, exactly. Very much. Yeah.
And speaking of different games from that era, we know you also worked on some kind of a hidden gem from the Lucas catalog, which is Eric's Adventure.
Oh, now that rings. Yeah,
Okay.
I remember that.
It's a very hidden gem, I guess.
Yeah, I don't remember much about that one. That's great. Yeah, so I'm drawing a bit of a blank on that, but yeah, I do remember the character for sure.
Yeah, there was a strange addition to the Lucas catalog, I remember. So
yeah. I mean, it's coming back to me very vaguely, but it doesn't. Some of the stuff from that time period, I don't have a lot of clarity about.
So it was a hidden gem also for one who works
yes,
on it.
Yes.
Yeah. Very hidden gem.
We have to tell Federico about this.
Yes. Another great collaborator of us that unfortunately can't afford to participate, but he send his cheers also to you.
He is a very fan of the obscure console. Everything, all the console that.
Yeah, that's right. That was a console game. Now that I remember, and I'm guessing that. I'm not sure that myself and Peter and Clint did much of the music for that game, because a lot of the time in those days we weren't working on the console games, just the Mac and PC games. Eventually started working on the console games, but I think that might have been one of those ones where we didn't work a lot on it directly. But maybe I'm wrong. I might have written music for it. I just can't remember.
It was good. I listened to it today. It was very nice.
All right. Yeah.
And speaking of Clint and Peter, how was rejoin them and work with them with the long-awaited return to Monkey Island?
Yeah, that was great. I mean, it's funny. We were friends before any of us worked at Lucas, and we've remained friends since. And it really just kind of falls together. Like it was amazing because a lot of it was during COVID, and we weren't able to be in the same location a lot, but it didn't really matter because we each knew exactly what to do and how that would fit with what the others were doing. The pieces just fit together. Everybody knows I do this, you do that. It just kind of comes together, and it was easy. It's an amazingly easy collaboration amongst the three of us.
What was new with this return to Monkey Island for you musically? I mean, you of course went back to the old themes, but what was different now?
Well, certainly the quality and amount of live instrumentation was great for me, because in previous Monkey Island games, I'd always used mostly synthesizers. I had some live players in Curse of Monkey Island, but the quality and amount of live players was great, especially the wind quartet, which was just beautiful. And they play with each other all the time and do a lot of work, and hearing writing the melodies on a synthesizer, and they seem to work pretty well as, melodies working together. But then when you hear these people play them and everybody's breathing the perfect phrasing into every note of every melody, it's just the shaping of it is just, that was to me a real eye opener. It's like, wow, I love that sound. It's such a great sound.
Wow, it is. And it's just recently been released. I saw that the soundtrack was released. So
yeah.
No more for PC speaker.
I have a small question that is outside the question that we have, but it's very near to the return of Monkey Island. How was to pass the time where no one can talk about anything? Because we have David Fox that is very funny. He say, I can talk only with my dog. And going crazy because he wants to shout to the world that he come again to work on that mighty game, but no one can talk about this. It's very, very hard, I think.
It was very strange. It was literally the secret of Monkey Island.
That's the real secret. Yeah.
That was the real secret, and you just had to hold that secret. I don't think anybody spilled it. I was amazed, but I don't think it got spilled, and that was a testament to how committed everybody was.
Yeah, that was a real shock.
Also for the date, the 1st of April.
Yeah, genius.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Ron Gilbert.
He's hilarious. That's like, yeah.
Great. And then I'm very happy that I have a lot of success the game, because there's a lot of fun. They speak very bad everywhere on the world. They want pixel art. They want this. They want this. But the time go on. The things change, and Ron Gilbert make a great game, because I think that is very play again. I finished the game in 3 days. I stay in front of the computer until I don't finish.
Great.
The sound, the location, the characters. It's my youngness.
Yes. Totally.
Very, very beautiful. Congratulations. And it's a real pleasure to have you here. Now we talk, but you are part of my life. We never meet, but you are part of my life.
You met tonight.
Yes, we did. Now we did. Thank you.
And speaking of young times, when we were all younger, I think one of your best soundtracks is The Dig. The one for The Dig.
Thank you.
It's very. I think it's iconic, really. What can you tell us about that soundtrack? The process of composing and recording that soundtrack.
Yeah, I would say in many ways that soundtrack comes from the deepest place inside of me of any of the stuff I've done. Remember I said earlier that I was, deeply connected to chord progressions. So if, the Dig soundtrack really explored the power of chord progressions. And then the other part of that was super cool was we got the rights to use recordings of a number of Wagner orchestral pieces. And so I was able to, and the thing about Wagner is a lot of times he'll get on a chord and he'll just hold this chord, but it'll have this amazing texture that just sort of undulates. And so I was able to take those recordings and cut them up into hundreds of little sections of just one chord. And wow. I then use those as samples to put underneath the synthesizer. So I would compose a piece that would have different chord progressions. And then I would say, okay, these are the chords that I used. I would listen to all the samples that had this particular chord in it. And I'd say, that sample seems to fit. And I'd stick it underneath. So every time the chord changed, underneath there was one Wagner piece going to another Wagner piece going to another Wagner piece. So every chord had its own personality to it. So that really gave it an otherworldly quality.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds like really comes from another world or something. I didn't know about the samples things. That's very fascinating.
Yeah, it really worked.
And did you have the idea of using Wagner as a reference from the start, or was it maybe in development? Or
I'm not sure when that idea came in, but I'm not even sure how it came in. Because it doesn't, it's like, where would that idea come from, right? It doesn't make any sense. Because like, why did we get the actual rights? Like, why was I allowed to do that? I can't remember the legality of it, but somehow or other, I think I remember I think somewhere along the storyline, we got in touch with the idea of doing a soundtrack for the music, and we got in touch with Angel Records to release the soundtrack, and they had all these recordings. And we thought, we're going to release a soundtrack with these folks. Maybe they'll let us use some of this material. And Wagner was the obvious choice. So I think it kind of came about that way. It's through the record company. But yeah, it's definitely kind of a neat way to go.
Nice.
Yeah.
A lucky coincidence. So.
Yeah. Very much.
Just a curiosity from the community. Is really a curiosity. How is your typical work day? How you interact with the team, and what's your inspiration?
Yeah, that's a great question. Mostly it's playing a keyboard, and I just riff. I just get on a keyboard and I just start riffing and coming up with little patterns and stuff, and then whatever catches my ear, I'll run with it. And so it's a little bit like you're generating material, but you're also listening really carefully, going, where's something interesting in there? And if you tool around for long enough, you'll eventually find something interesting, and you have to notice it. The key is to notice it and then go inside of it. So that's the trick. And then once in a while, not very often, but once in a while, I'll just be, washing the dishes, and some melody will pop into my head, and I'll go, oh, that's a melody I should keep, and I should use that as the theme. So sometimes it just comes that way, but most of the time it just comes from noodling on the keyboard.
So you compose mainly on the keyboards nowadays, or?
Yeah, always have. Yeah.
Okay.
It's I'm not really capable of performing a piano piece in public, but I'm perfectly adequate as a composer keyboard player.
Nice.
What is Michael Land currently dedicated to? Any new project, including personal ones, on the horizon? I don't know if I.
Yeah, I mean that's been a. I mean, right now I have a job. I work in software, but I have in my mind and sort of the back of my mind the intention to try to write some personal music, while I still can. Um, and so, yeah, it might take me. I mean, how do I say this? There have been different times in my life where I've approached this, but I know that I have to get to it in a serious way pretty soon. So I'm really just trying to currently arrange my life so that I can dive in and start doing some composition that's just my voice and not necessarily, music for picture. Music for picture is a wonderful thing, but it is a different thing than just music for music. They're two different kinds of things. And so I'm really looking forward at some point to do music for music and just, put it out on the web or whatever and just start to build a body of music that's just music for music. So that'll happen.
We're looking forward for it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Just out of curiosity, do you happen to also play live sometimes with this music or your music in general?
Not very much. I mean, I've had the great pleasure a few times of, playing Monkey Island with Tommy Tallarico and his video games live orchestral experience, which is a wonderful thing to be able to do. So that's great when that comes around once in a while. Mostly, I do play bass in an occasional band here and there, but it's not really, that's just sort of folk music or whatever. But I think that, that would be like another phase even beyond writing my own music would be to figure out how to play live.
Oh, yeah.
And that would be a lot of fun. I think actually that would be a great thing, but I have to actually, think a little bit about how to just write some music first and then worry about how to take it live.
And speaking of music and writing music, is there a soundtrack that you would have liked to compose?
I've always been a huge fan of all the Morricone spaghetti westerns. Like those, I love those because they are so creative and whimsical, but at the same time they hit you hard in the gut, and that's what I love about them. So yeah, that would be yeah. That's
also I agree. Also, I think Morricone, in his soundtracks, he had many elements coming from the free improvisational scene and atonal stuff. It's in there.
Yes, absolutely.
Makes it very interesting to the ear, I think.
Yeah, he pulled everything from all over and used all the tools available. Yeah, such a creative guy.
Nice.
Yeah.
And with Outlaws, someone, Clint, I suppose.
I think
Clint wrote Outlaws and did an amazing job.
Wow,
of
yeah.
That, yeah. He nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I confirm. I love this music. I love this music. Also Morricone once, but also the Outlaws soundtrack is very.
It's great.
Splendid.
And Matteo, we have some questions from Vanak, right?
Now? Yeah. Our Monkey Island Encyclopedia. Okay. At the beginning of that, I want to say from his words, that could be also mine, that he is a huge fan of the entire Monkey Island saga, and its music constitutes at least 50% of the success of the video game in the series, and that the video game and fan that I am today, speaking of Vanak, I owe mostly to him and people like him who laid the foundation of this media, and then we will never know how to thank him. So his words, but could also be mine. And he asking, how does it feel to have been and still be a reference points that many of the modern composers are inspired by when they have to create a tune for video games, and knowing that, and how does it feel that your music is even played in theaters and public events? So a lot of questions.
No, thank you for that. That's it's amazing. I feel so blessed, really is the word, to have found that validation of some of my work. It's amazing to see the love that comes for some of that material, and yeah, it's just a wonderful thing, and has been for many years, and I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the music.
Thank you.
I use it as the sound of my cell phone. the tune of LeChuck. So when my mother called me, it was beautiful.
That's great.
Very fun.
This is some question that we have from our community. You can answer. I translate in English. I don't know if I write good. I hope yes.
What is the soundtrack that has most moved you to compose? That would be The Dig, for sure. It touched me very much. With what musical tools did you compose Monkey Island? Yeah, so as we discussed in the first Monkey Island, it was the MT32 was the main instrument, second one as well. But then for Monkey Island 3, that I'd used the E4. It's a sampler, which had many megabytes of sample space available. So I put together a set of orchestral and Caribbean samples and had a giant MIDI template with, I don't know, 40 or 50 different tracks that I could just instantly go to any track and pick any instrument and start performing on the keyboard for that instrument. And so I was able to create whatever texture I wanted very quickly. So that was really nice in that. And then some of those got replaced with live players, but most of it, the samples ended up just sitting. Oh, there was one guy though, we had an accordion player come in who was just ridiculous. This accordion player, Peter Suave, he had won this competition, and so we brought him in, and I wrote the most difficult accordion music I could possibly think of, and put it in front of him in the studio, and he would just like play it once to just get familiar with, like literally play it through perfectly, and then it's like, okay, record me, and so we press record, and then he'd play it again perfectly, only this time he was just ripping it and just kicking it, and it was just like, oh my God, this guy's amazing. So that was a lot of fun.
Wow.
If you had started working on games that were later canceled, funny, The Dig was canceled many times, but eventually it made it out. But I don't think many of the other games were canceled, but that was that had quite a saga to it. But eventually it came out, finally. I'm so glad it did.
The music of The Dig was canceled as well, or was kept on all the
I think
the end likely story of The Dig?
Yeah, some of the music changed a little bit. Like when in some of the early versions of the game, I had written a few pieces, and then those pieces didn't make it into the final game, but they were started to become the sort of the source of some of the themes, and so it all kind of evolved. But yeah, it was the music kept on a single direction, I would say, throughout. If you started working on games, and then since he also contributed to the creation of iMuse, what did you have to consider for making transitions? Yeah, so with transitions, a lot the best way we found to do transitions was if you're in a piece of music and you have to write an ending chunk, you would go to that piece of music and pick one or two measures, find a measure, maybe 2 or 3 times do this, where you think this represents the texture, and you would take that music and you'd copy it and you'd paste it out there as a separate measure, and then you would start from that in order to make sure that when it did the transition, it would go to something that sounded like what you're coming from. But then once you're there, you can change it and take it to wherever you're going, either to the end or to another piece. So always start with where the material from where you're leaving and departing from as the beginning of the transition, and it usually works pretty well. Something like transitioning from music A, fade out, transition. Yeah, that I think I just answered that.
Yeah,
It's the same question, yeah.
And then for the first monkeys, were the music pieces created entirely with the musical keyboard and computer? Yeah. So entirely digital or manually directly on the computer with the mouse control? No, always with the keyboard and the MT32 was the starting point. In Return to Monkey Island, were the music pieces created digitally or did they contain recordings? So a lot of live musicians, I would say that, most of the score was initially composed with, samples and synthesizers, but there were, I would say, a very high percentage, vast majority of the pieces ended up with at least some live musicians, and a lot of the pieces had quite a few live musicians in terms of, parts that were originally done with a synthesizer that got replaced with a live musician. So yeah, a lot of live playing in Return to Monkey Island. How many transitions were written for the iMuse system in Monkey Island 2, and which theme had the most? Yeah, Woodtick, for sure. Woodtick definitely was crazy. I think it had probably over 100 transitions, but the other pieces, typically what we would do is we would have 3 we found was a good number. So 3 ending chunks. So usually if you have a loop and it lasts for like a minute, you pick 3 places in that piece and create, from each one of them, you would just cut and paste a measure or 2 measures and put it out there and make an ending chunk. So usually 2 or 3 endings for every piece, or transitions if you're going from one piece to another, would do the trick. You don't have to do a separate ending for every measure in order for it to work. It works great if you do that, but it's way too much work. And usually you can get away with even 1 is oftentimes enough. But a lot of times, if you're going to, in pieces where you're going to go back and forth a lot, if it's a heavily trafficked transition, you're going to want several options that are randomly selected so that you don't always hear the same transition. But if it's something that happens just once in a great while, 1's usually enough. Let's see. What have you composed in the years following? On Wikipedia, I see little or nothing of original music after my class. It's mostly production or sound design. And if you haven't composed anything else, why? And then, what are your favorite soundtracks? Yeah, I've already mentioned the Morricone is definitely one of my favorite soundtracks. That is, if you haven't composed anything else, why?
Big question.
Yeah. I ask myself that question constantly. That is my question for myself. And frankly, I don't have a good answer for this person or for myself as to why, other than I think I can sort of answer it, which is when I was at LucasArts, it was my job to write music. So wake up in the morning, go to work, and then all day long, your job is to write music. I was managing the department, a lot of times too, but when I was actually in the middle of a score, I would just somehow manage to push that work away and stay focused on composing. Because the thing about composing that I found is that you really need to get the juices going. You really need to sort of seed the process. It doesn't work if you're composing a couple of hours on one day, and then 3 days later you can compose for a couple of more hours, and then another day goes by and then you compose. For me, I need to be composing all the time, working on whatever the music is constantly, and then it starts to grow inside me. And if you don't have that, if your life is not set up to have that much space to dedicate to music, I find it's very difficult to get the momentum. And that's probably the reason why I haven't been able to set up my life since I was working at LucasArts, where it was my job. I haven't been able to set up my life where I have that much time to focus on music. And so when I say I'm really trying to work towards getting there, it's really because what that really means is I'm trying to work towards setting up my life so that I have that much focus to be able to do it. And that's, something I really hope to be able to do, because it's a wonderful thing when you're deeply inside the world and the music is just happening all by itself in your head because you're constantly doing it. And it takes a while to ramp that up. When I was working on games, a lot of the time, it would be like, you work on a game for a year. The first 2 months, 3 months, you're just getting the wheel turning. But then once it's really going, after 2 or 3 months, you can just produce so much material so easily because it's all flowing. but it takes a lot of focus to get the flow really started, and that's the big challenge in today's world, is being able to find that amount of focus. So I think that's the answer to that.
Yeah, I totally understand. You have to be in the zone. Like,
yeah
you have to be there.
and be there a lot.
Yes.
And be able to return every day and go deeper and deeper and deeper every day. That's
exactly
a challenge, and so that's what I'm hoping to be able to do. How is it to write music for a dynamic system where it changes in real time depending on the situation? Yeah, that was, the one thing that I could say about that is when we would approach the music, certainly we all did it this way. All three of us, myself, Peter, and Clint, did this, but I'll just speak about my own experience of it. I always would begin the process by creating something that looks like a subway map. Like you have this station and this station, and they're connected by this line, and this station is connected with that line. So you'd get all the different locations of the game, put them on a big map, and show with lines how they connect. And then you go, okay, that's what I'm scoring. That is the score of the game. It has to score that picture and that map. And then you start, for my process, what I would do is I would kind of go, okay, what are the moods for the different places? How do the moods relate to each other? A lot of times I would even work it out in terms of key areas. Like I would say, okay, this island is in daytime, it's a G major. But then you have this island over here and it's nighttime, so that's going to be D minor. And you have you start to think, and it's not just how do they relate to each other on a little level, but like in the case of the dig, there was this central area which was like a circle, it literally was subway stations that went around in a ring, and off of each one was one of the spires, and I came up with the keys of each of those points so that you could go around in this way and it would sound beautiful going from key to key, or you could go in the other direction and it would sound beautiful going from key to key, and then whatever key you were in, that became the key that you would go and get more deeply into for that section. So it literally is like you have to architect, for me anyway, you architect the harmonic structure of the entire game as this larger map, and then start filling in the details. So that's how it is for me.
Wow.
Graphic adventures often had famous and vibrant themes when characters entered or at the beginning and end, and more static, atmospheric songs in the actual gameplay. Absolutely. Which ones do you prefer to compose? What challenge does... Oh, that's a great question. So we would call what he's calling static, atmospheric songs, we call those ambiences. And so we really a lot of times thought of themes and ambiences. And yes, exactly right, that the themes are the moments where either a character enters or leaves, or something big is happening. And actually, a lot of times we actually, in iMuse, we broke it up and we called them states and sequences. So a state is essentially a loop that can go forever. And a sequence is something that has a finite duration that happens when something happens. And obviously, if it's a sequence, you can make the music, if it's a cartoony thing, you can make it be like a Looney Tune thing. Or if it's a character showing up, you can play their theme in the full glory of their theme. But if it's a loop, you don't know how long you're going to be there. And so a lot of times what we would do with these loops is we would have it start with something kind of announcement, big, and then it would, funny thing, with a lot of linear music, you start small and then make it big at the end. But we would do the opposite. We would start big, and then it would get increasingly smaller and smaller and more ambient. And then the ambient part at the end would loop just the ambient part. So when you go into a space, you get something that announces the space, but then it settles down and it stays down. And so for me, I always personally preferred, the themes and the more sort of where the music is more active, just because that's kind of how I naturally approach music. I will say that Peter McConnell was especially good at the ambiences. His ambiences were so amazing because they just, I don't know how to say it exactly, but they were so organic and so interesting, but at the same time, really ambient and really sparse. And for me, it was always a challenge to write in that style because he did it so naturally, and I had to really struggle with it. So I would definitely say that different people have different orientations around this, but it really is putting all those pieces together that makes the score successful. What do you think of the soundtracks of modern games? Any preferences, possibly? I don't so much keep up on soundtracks, but I do know that I heard some lately, and it was a few years ago, but I really liked the Hobbit. There was a game called The Hobbit. It had such a beautiful soundtrack. So yeah,
Nice.
that was one of the ones I really enjoyed.
Are there more questions after?
Yeah,
another page. For the dig, have him describe from A to Z his first contact with
Everything.
Typical day. How he interacted with the team. What inspired him. Let him speak freely, and then 1 hour
video on YouTube.
This person obviously enjoys the dig.
Digging it, yes.
Yes, absolutely. I think if I remember correctly, I never really worked with Noah. I think Noah was the original person on the dig, and I didn't really work with him very much. And then when Brian Moriarty took it over, I worked with him a little bit. It was, early production, so I did just like a music for like a trailer video, which that was great because Brian he had a real cinematic feel, and that was where some of the themes first started to emerge. And then when Sean took it over, working with Sean was great because Sean was Sean Clark, more of a he had worked on Sam & Max a bunch, and he had sort of more of a game, I don't know how to say exactly, but more of an adventure game kind of aesthetic. In other words, he was more like just going to get this thing built, this game that nobody could finish. He was going to finish the thing. So he did, and amazingly enough. And so he was really not overbearing with his aesthetic guidance. He allowed the creative process of the different people to sort of flourish, which was great. And he sort of made sure that all the pieces mesh with all the other pieces. And I remember one time in the intro to the game, real learning lesson for me, probably for Sean as well, because we were struggling with how to fit the dialogue and the music and the graphics together, because it's, a bunch of different pieces. And so at one point, Hal Barwood came in and took a look at what we were doing. And he just made some suggestions. He was like, put this here, put that there. And all of a sudden, it just fell into place. And the reason was because Hal had been a film director, and he really had a lot of understanding of that, the dialogue and the music and the visuals, they all have to be one thing. You can't, write the dialogue and then put the music around the dialogue, or put the dialogue to the visuals. You can't think that way. They all have to, it's sort of like the attention of the user has to be brought from one to the other, to the other, to the other, and just kind of weave in and out. And I can't even really explain why that was so enlightening to me, but I just suddenly understood that, this medium, the audio-visual medium, is an audio-visual medium. It's one medium where all the different elements can't be conceived of as separate things. They have to be conceived of as different parts of one thing. And I really enjoyed learning that in that context, because I just didn't understand that before. It's not an obvious thing until you've seen somebody who really understands it put it together. And ever since then, I've kept that lesson and really, tried to use that understanding in everything I've done.
Fantastic.
That's not an hour, but I think that's. But yeah, it was actually really wonderful. I mean, the story, of course, is a great story. It's from Spielberg, and I really feel like the game was a journey of losing yourself and then finding yourself, and that really resonated a lot. So yeah, I think it's a really powerful game. Any anecdotes related to the creation of the Revolution iMuse and why this innovative sound engine didn't become the standard in games that came after? Yeah.
Maybe with the last part we already answered it, because it's
exactly. It's
hundreds of pieces of.
Yeah, it was just a lot of work. One thing I will say about the evolution of that system over the years is in the very first version of it with LeChuck's Revenge, we created a bunch of function calls, API calls that the game programmer had to call directly. So, we would say, on this piece of music, set this jump hook when this happens, and set this jump hook when that happens, and, change this parameter when that happens. And what we found is that we spent a lot of time sitting with the programmers, looking over their shoulders, trying things out, realizing, oh, wait, no, we forgot to tell you got to do this as well. And there was just a huge overhead to that. And so what we did for the next couple of games and what we figured out to do is we created essentially an abstraction layer, which is, what I mentioned earlier, the states and the sequences, so that the game programmer just had to know, trigger this sequence or trigger this state. And then we had a bunch of code in between that we would, as composers, say, well, when they trigger this state, that really means set this jump hook and change this parameter and turn the volume of this down to that. In other words, we would be the ones who would figure out how to execute the command in music, rather than having the game developer have to write the specific code in detail. And it turns out that approach really is the same approach that Wise and Fmod use. So in a sense, this approach really did become the standard. It's just it wasn't iMuse, it was these other engines that used it. But yeah, the approach really held water, and that is kind of how a lot of stuff is done in games today.
Much more simple for the composer, also for the programmer.
Yeah,
exactly.
Nowadays, yes.
Yeah, the phrase we used to use is good fences make good neighbors. So we would make sure that we had a good fence, and it worked out well. As a composer of music for video games, I'd be interested in knowing how the group was organized in Monkey Island 2 with colleagues Peter, McConnell, Clint Bajakian. Thank you. Yeah. So I think what we pretty much did there is we each took an island. I think a lot of these games, the Monkey Island games, for some reason they often had 3 really big islands. Sometimes they'd have a few extra little places and small islands, but for the most part there were 3 or so big islands, and we would just say, okay, I'll take this island, you take that island, you take that island. And that really worked well, because the different personality of the composers would have a certain integrity within the island, but then, and all the transitions between the islands and all the other parts of the game, it could be anybody who would do different pieces. In fact, a lot of times, one of us, myself or Peter or Clint, would start working on a piece of music, and then halfway through we'd hand it off to the other guy and he'd finish it and put it in the game. So a lot of pieces were written by multiple composers, because we were so familiar with each other's style and what the game demanded. But that was in the glue areas, but then there was these zones where each composer would put their own personality in, and that was really, I think it worked really well, because each island would feel like a different place, not just visually, but also musically.
You're welcome. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Very
you so
insightful.
much.
Appreciate it.
We were very pleased to have you.
Thank you. My pleasure. All mine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye, thank you.